In the dim archive, the archivist slowly looks up from a heavy leather volume. The year is 1826. In an English town, an obscure apothecary named John Walker accidentally scrapes a dried chemical drop from his hearth. A sudden flash of bright fire erupts on a tiny wooden stick. What nobody knew at the time was a hidden corporate war had just begun. This cheap tool would soon build vast corporate empires. It would also systematically rot the living faces of thousands of destitute young women. This ordinary household object was the modern friction match. Beneath its convenient flame lies a dark, terrifying history of industrial slaughter. It is a story about corporate greed and complete control over the human body. Before the 19th century, human life was dictated by absolute darkness. The simple act of creating fire was a daily battle. Imagine waking up in a freezing, pitch-black room during a brutal winter. Your fingers are stiff and split from the biting cold. To get warmth, you could not simply press a button or strike a small stick. You had to use a heavy iron strike-a-light against a piece of sharp flint. You would strike the metal repeatedly against the stone to create a tiny spark. This spark had to land perfectly on a bed of dry tinder. Tinder was often made of charred rags, dried moss, or fungus. One mistake or a slight draft would instantly extinguish the fragile spark. The process took 10, 20, or even 30 minutes of agonizing physical exertion. For the impoverished masses, this was a relentless morning torture. Their hands were covered in painful bruises from missing the flint in the dark. If the tinder became damp from the morning mist, you were entirely defeated. You would have no heat, no hot food, and no light. Think about that for a second. Entire families routinely froze in their own homes due to damp moss. And no, I'm not making that up. People actually died of hypothermia because their flint refused to spark. Consequently, ancient communities developed a terrifying dependence on the communal hearth. Fire was never allowed to die out completely. Every night, citizens carefully buried glowing coals under layers of ash. This process was known as curfew. If your fire died, you had to beg your neighbor for a hot coal. You would carry this burning ember through the dark streets in a clay pot. This desperate reliance created an incredibly dangerous urban environment. One sudden gust of wind could scatter sparks across a thatched roof. Entire wooden cities were regularly reduced to ash by a single misplaced ember. Fire was a capricious and cruel master. It required constant, exhausting human vigilance. People tried to find chemical alternatives to this daily madness. Chemists experimented with dangerous acids and volatile gases. They created the fire piston, which used compressed air to ignite tinder. They also invented the Dobereiner lamp, which mixed highly flammable hydrogen gas with platinum. These devices were expensive, heavy, and prone to violent explosions. They were luxury items for wealthy scientists. The average peasant remained trapped in the dark ages of flint and steel. Humanity desperately needed a cheap, portable, and instantaneous source of artificial light. The breakthrough finally arrived in the northern English town of Stockton-on-Tees. The year was 1826. An unassuming apothecary named John Walker spent his days mixing volatile chemical compounds in his small shop. He was trying to create an easily applicable explosive for hunting rifles. One afternoon, Walker was stirring a highly unstable mixture of antimony sulfide and potassium chlorate. He used a simple wooden splint to blend the white paste. He noticed a small, stubborn drop of the mixture had dried on the tip of the wood. To clean it, he naturally scraped the stick against his stone hearth. A sharp crackle echoed through the room. A bright, steady flame instantly erupted from the wood. Walker stared at the burning splint in absolute astonishment. He had accidentally invented the world's first practical friction match. He called his creation the Congreve rocket, named after a famous military explosive. Walker began manufacturing these magical sticks by hand in his pharmacy. He cut the wood pieces himself. He dipped each tip into the chemical paste. He sold them in small tin tubes containing 80 matches each. Each tin cost 1 shilling, which was a significant sum for a poor laborer. He even included a piece of sandpaper for striking. The invention spread rapidly through the local community. completely transformed the daily lives of everyone who bought it. People could suddenly conjure fire in less than 2 seconds. The exhausting struggle with flint and steel disappeared overnight. Yet, John Walker was not a businessman. He possessed a deeply charitable and philosophical soul. Local industrialists begged him to secure a royal patent for his invention. They knew it could generate an unimaginable fortune. Walker categorically refused to restrict his creation. He believed that cheap fire belonged to all of humanity. He wanted the poorest peasants to access it without corporate taxes. This noble generosity proved to be his personal undoing. Because he refused to protect his idea, others ruthlessly exploited it. A London inventor named Samuel Jones observed Walker's matches in action. Jones instantly copied the chemical formula without giving any credit. He began mass-producing them under the name lucifers. Shortly after, another inventor named Isaac Holden improved the mixture to reduce the harsh sulfur smell. None of these early pioneers managed to secure a dominant monopoly. John Walker watched from afar as his life-changing invention was stolen by aggressive capitalists. He continued his quiet work as a modest apothecary. He never received a single penny of royalty. He died in 1859 in complete obscurity and relative poverty. His name was largely forgotten by the public. Meanwhile, the global market for matches was exploding into a multi-million-dollar industry. Corporate entities realized that fire was the ultimate mass-consumer commodity. Everyone on Earth needed to buy it repeatedly. The early lucifer matches had major practical flaws. They were incredibly difficult to ignite. You had to strike them with immense physical force against sandpaper. When they finally caught fire, they showered the user with dangerous sparks. They also released a suffocating, foul cloud of sulfurous smoke. In 1830, a young French chemistry student named Charles Sauria solved this problem. He introduced a new ingredient into the chemical recipe. That ingredient was white phosphorus. White phosphorus was a miraculous and terrifying substance. It possessed a remarkably low ignition temperature. A match tipped with white phosphorus would ignite smoothly against almost any dry surface. You could strike it on leather, wood, or even the fabric of your trousers. Production costs plummeted instantly. Matches could now be manufactured for a fraction of a penny per box. This chemical innovation sparked an industrial revolution. Factories emerged across Europe and North America. They produced billions of matches annually to meet the insatiable global demand. The simple stick of wood became a cornerstone of modern industrial society. It allowed factories to run night shifts easily. It permitted miners to work deep underground. It fueled the massive expansion of the tobacco industry. What nobody knew at the time was that white phosphorus was a devastating biological poison. It was highly volatile and highly toxic to human tissue. But the rising industrial barons did not care about chemical safety. They only saw the astronomical profit margins. They flooded the market with these cheap, hyper-flammable matches. They systematically built a global empire on a foundation of hidden human suffering. The global match market quickly centralized into a few massive corporate monopolies. In Britain, the dominant force was a company called Bryant and May. They established a gargantuan manufacturing complex in the Bow district of London. This area was home to thousands of desperate, impoverished Irish immigrants. The factory owners realized they could exploit this endless supply of cheap labor. They constructed vast, unventilated brick warehouses designed for maximum output. Inside these walls, a highly rigid hierarchical system was established. The corporate executives sat in opulent boardrooms in the West End. They watched their stock prices soar to unprecedented heights. They calculated dividends using complex mathematical projections. They became some of the wealthiest individuals in the British Empire. At the same time, the physical matchbox became an essential tool of global trade. British matches were shipped to the furthest corners of the earth. They crossed the Atlantic to American plantations. They traveled down the Suez Canal to Indian markets. They arrived in the ports of Australia and China. The match industry completely altered the geopolitical landscape. It created entirely new dependencies between industrialized nations and colonial territories. governments realized that taxing matches could generate immense national revenue. In the United States, the federal government implemented a special revenue stamp tax on matchboxes during the Civil War. This tax raised millions of dollars to fund military operations. Fire was no longer a basic human right. It was a heavily taxed, corporate-controlled commodity. The physical design of modern cities began to shift because of this tiny item. Before matches, houses required massive, specialized brick chimneys to keep fires burning safely. Now, cheap matches allowed for the rapid construction of high-density tenement housing. These new apartments lacked complex hearths. They relied instead on cheap gas stoves and portable heaters. The match enabled the modern urban lifestyle. It allowed workers to live in tiny, cramped spaces without freezing. It liberated women from the exhausting chore of hearth maintenance. But this surface-level progress masked a rotten core. The corporate masters knew their manufacturing process was fundamentally toxic. They hid the scientific reports. They silenced the factory inspectors with financial bribes. They maintained their perfect public image through aggressive marketing campaigns. They presented themselves as benevolent patrons of progress. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The corporate elite viewed their workers as disposable machinery. They calculated that the cost of replacing dead employees was significantly lower than the cost of updating factory ventilation. This clinical calculation allowed them to maximize their profit margins. It ensured their total dominance over the global market. They weaponized the economic desperation of the working class. They created a system where survival required self-destruction. The stage was set for one of the most horrific industrial cover-ups in human history. The global shipping industry had to adapt to the highly volatile nature of white phosphorus matches. Merchant ships carrying crates of lucifers frequently caught fire in the middle of the ocean. A single rough wave could cause the matchboxes to rub together inside the cargo hold. The resulting friction would trigger a massive, unstoppable chemical fire. Insurance companies began demanding exorbitant premiums for vessels carrying these dangerous goods. In response, match corporations designed specialized, airtight tin packaging to suppress oxygen. They also lobbied international maritime boards to loosen safety regulations. They used their immense wealth to dictate the rules of global shipping. Political leaders regularly accepted campaign donations from match tycoons. The law was systematically twisted to protect corporate interests over public safety. The corporate exploitation also extended to the harvesting of raw materials. The match industry required an astronomical amount of timber. Vast tracts of ancient pine forests in Scandinavia and Canada were clear-cut to supply match factories. The wood had to be perfectly straight and free of knots. This demand completely reshaped the forestry industry. It created a highly lucrative logging boom that displaced indigenous populations. The environmental footprint of the humble matchstick was immense. Entire ecosystems were destroyed to provide the disposable splints for urban consumers. The match was a perfect micro-representation of the capitalist machine. It extracted natural resources from the colonies. It exploited cheap labor in the cities. It sold a short-lived, disposable product back to the public. It forced the consumer into a cycle of perpetual repurchase. From behind his massive oak desk, the archivist looks directly into the camera lens with a cold, cynical expression. The green banker's lamp casts sharp shadows across his silver-gray hair. He notes that corporate marketing has always been a highly refined art of weaponizing human shame. The match barons did not just sell fire. They sold the illusion of modern civilization while hiding the biological debt of their workers. If you want to uncover how these hidden corporate cartels continue to shape our modern infrastructure, subscribe to this channel right now. Join our archive to expose the secret machinery of history. He slowly turns a yellowed page, and his voice reverts to a cold, detached narration. The true human cost of this global empire was borne by the match girls of London. These workers were young girls and children as young as 6. They worked 14 hours a day in the damp, dark underbelly of the Bryant and May factory. The air inside the dipping rooms was a thick fog of yellow-white phosphorus fumes. There were no exhaust fans. There were no open windows. The corporate owners refused to install ventilation to keep rooms warm. They prioritized drying speed over human lungs. The girls stood in this toxic atmosphere from dawn until dusk. They breathed the poison with every breath. The physical misery began slowly. The workers first noticed a persistent, nagging ache in their teeth. They assumed it was a common cavity from their poor diet. But the pain did not stop. It quickly intensified into a throbbing, agonizing torment. The white phosphorus gas was reacting directly with the moisture in their mouths. The chemical seeped through tooth decay directly to the jawbone. The poison systematically cut off the blood supply to the bone tissue. It triggered a horrific, incurable condition known medically as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. The workers simply called it phossy jaw. The disease was a slow, agonizing process of living decomposition. It literally rotted the human face from the inside out. As the disease progressed, the gums began to swell and ulcerate. Foul green pus constantly drained into their mouths. The intense odor of rotting bone forced family members to flee. The pain became entirely unmanageable, kept the young girls awake for days on end. The infection soon consumed the entire mandible tissue. The jawbone began to die and separate from the surrounding flesh. This dead bone was called a sequestrum. In the absolute darkness of their cramped tenement bedrooms, a terrifying phenomenon occurred. The breath and the exposed bones of these dying girls began to glow. They emitted a pale, eerie, greenish-white luminescent light. And no, I'm not making that up. The affected workers literally glowed in the dark like ghosts. Corporate executives were fully aware of this glowing horror. Their response was immediate and completely ruthless. The moment a girl showed signs of a swollen jaw, she was instantly fired. She was cast out onto the streets without a single penny of compensation. The company wanted to remove the visible evidence of their negligence. They did not want other workers to panic. The fired girls were left to die in absolute destitution. They could no longer chew solid food. They had to survive on liquids poured down their throats. Many starved to death in their beds. The medical treatment of the era was just as brutal as the disease itself. There were no antibiotics to stop the spreading infection. The only known way to save a worker's life was radical surgery. Surgeons sliced open cheeks from ear to chin to saw away rotting bones. They often removed the entire lower half of the face without proper anesthesia. This left the surviving girls permanently and horribly disfigured. They could no longer speak clearly. They could never close their mouths. They became social outcasts, forced to wear thick veils to hide their missing faces. The match barons faced zero legal consequences for this mass disfigurement. They continued to collect their massive fortunes while their workers were systematically mutilated. To protect their enormous profits, the match corporations orchestrated a massive, sophisticated conspiracy of silence. They systematically subverted the medical establishment of London. Bryant and May employed their own company doctors to inspect the workforce. These physicians were paid handsome salaries to misdiagnose the symptoms of phossy jaw. They recorded the horrific bone necrosis as simple toothaches on official certificates. If a local hospital doctor attempted to report a genuine case of phosphorus poisoning to the government, the factory owners intervened. They used their immense financial influence to pressure hospital boards. They threatened to withdraw their substantial charitable donations if the medical reports were made public. The medical community was effectively silenced by corporate gold. The conspiracy also completely co-opted the contemporary mainstream press. The match barons were major advertisers in the leading newspapers of the Victorian era. They spent thousands of pounds filling pages with beautifully illustrated advertisements for their safety lucifers. Editors knew that publishing stories about rotting jawbones would instantly destroy this vital advertising revenue. Consequently, the horrific plight of the match workers was entirely blacked out from the public eye. For decades, the middle-class consumers bought matchboxes without any inkling of the atrocities committed in the East End factories. The corporate narrative remained perfectly pristine. The match was celebrated as a triumph of domestic convenience. Dead teenagers were buried in unmarked graves beneath layers of public relations. The factory owners even instituted a terrifying system of internal espionage to maintain total control. They hired ruthless overseers who patrolled the packing rooms constantly. These foremen implemented a strict system of monetary fines for the smallest infractions. Workers were fined for arriving late. They were fined for dropping boxes. They were fined for talking during the 14-hour shift. The most severe punishment was reserved for anyone who complained about jaw pain. If a girl mentioned her throbbing teeth to a coworker, she was labeled a subverter and blacklisted. This meant she could never find employment in any factory across London. The workers were kept in a state of perpetual terror and absolute financial submission. The wall of corporate silence finally began to crack in the summer of 1888. A courageous social activist and investigative journalist named Annie Besant learned of the horrific conditions inside the Bow factory. Besant was a fierce champion who refused to be intimidated by wealthy match barons. She secretly met with groups of match girls in dark London taverns. She listened to their heartbreaking stories of physical pain, corporate fines, and extreme poverty. She documented the gruesome details of phossy jaw with clinical precision. She looked directly at the scarred, toothless faces of teenage girls who had been discarded by Bryant and May. In June 1888, Besant published a searing, explosive article in her weekly newspaper, The Link. The article was titled White Slavery in London and indicted the match industry. Besant exposed the massive financial disparity between the wealthy shareholders and the starving workers. She revealed that Bryant and May paid their investors massive 20% dividends while paying their workers pennies. Most importantly, she dragged the horrific reality of phossy jaw into the public spotlight. She described the glowing bones and the amputated faces in visceral, undeniable detail. The article sent shockwaves through Victorian society. It completely shattered the pristine image of the corporate titans. The reaction from the factory owners was swift and completely predictable. They were furious at this public exposure. They immediately gathered the workers on the factory floor. They presented them with a prepared legal document. The document claimed conditions were excellent and Besant's article was a lie. The foreman ordered the girls to sign the document under threat of immediate termination. But something unprecedented happened. A young worker named Sarah Chapman stood up and refused to sign. Her defiance sparked a sudden, massive wave of solidarity. Within hours, over 1,400 match girls walked out of the factory. They dropped their frames and marched into the dusty streets of London. The Great Match Girls' Strike of 1888 had officially begun. The strike was a historic turning point in the history of labor exploitation. The match girls were completely penniless. They had no union strike funds to support their families. They faced immediate starvation, yet they refused to break their ranks. Annie Besant and her political allies organized a massive public fundraising campaign. They collected national donations and distributed bread to the striking girls. The match girls organized protest marches carrying banners demanding an end to phosphorus poisoning. The public was deeply moved by the sight of these pale, impoverished young women fighting against a multi-million-pound corporation. Bryant and May attempted to break the strike by importing strikebreakers from other regions. But the local community blockaded the factory gates. The corporate owners realized they were losing the public relations war. Their stock prices began to tumble as consumers initiated a massive boycott of Bryant and May matches. After 3 weeks of intense resistance, the match barons finally capitulated. They agreed to all the workers' core demands. They abolished the unjust system of monetary fines. They created a separate, clean dining room so workers would not ingest phosphorus with their food. Most importantly, they recognized the newly formed Matchmakers' Union. It was the first union in British history formed entirely by unskilled women workers. However, the ultimate victory over white phosphorus required a complete technological shift. The solution had actually existed for decades. In 1844, a Swedish chemist named Gustav Erik Pask invented the safety match. He replaced the highly toxic white phosphorus on the match head with non-toxic red phosphorus. The red phosphorus sat safely on the outside of the box to prevent accidental ignition. More importantly, red phosphorus did not produce toxic fumes. It did not cause the horrific phossy jaw necrosis. But corporate manufacturers had systematically ignored this safe alternative for over 40 years because red phosphorus was slightly more expensive to source. They chose to let human faces rot to save a fraction of a penny. The global adoption of safety matches was accelerated by the Lundstrom brothers in Sweden. They perfected Pask's design and won a pioneering medal at the Paris exhibition in 1855. Their success forced British and American corporations to reconsider their chemical choices. Yet, corporate inertia remained incredibly strong. The established monopolies fought against safety regulations in courts for decades. They argued that a total ban on white phosphorus would destroy national economies and eliminate jobs. They weaponized economic fear to maintain their toxic production lines. They only converted their factories when the threat of total consumer abandonment became an absolute financial reality. Change only occurred when governments were forced to step in due to immense public outrage. Finland banned white phosphorus matches in 1872. Denmark followed shortly after. Finally, in 1906, an international treaty known as the Berne Convention was signed. It completely prohibited the manufacture, distribution, and importation of white phosphorus matches across Europe. The global corporate giants were legally forced to adopt the safe red phosphorus formula. The era of phossy jaw was finally brought to a permanent end by the collective power of international law and grassroots human resistance. This marked the historic birth of our modern consumer safety regulations across the globe. The archivist slowly closes his massive folio and removes his glasses. John Walker sought to tame fire in 1826. Systems change, but human nature remains the same. Subscribe if this history surprised you. Click the video on your screen now to explore deeper secrets.